During my years at university, I started volunteering with a search and rescue team. After finishing my studies, I joined them part-time as an employee and stayed there for a year until I found a full-time job. I spent most of my life in those mountains. My dad had been taking us there since I was 5 years old, and when I started learning to rock climb at 13, I spent even more time in the area. It didn't take long before I started to regret my decision. I lasted nearly a year in my new job, but in the end, I couldn't resist the call of the mountains any longer. I contacted my former boss, and he agreed to take me back as a full-time employee. The pay was significantly lower, but I was willing to make the sacrifice. I stayed there for 10 years until my first child was born, and I had to take a better-paying job in California. My memory isn't what it used to be, and that's why I think it's time to tell my most important story before I completely forget it. It all started a few months after I returned to the team, and it would take almost 15 years to solve. The case began with the disappearance of a hiker. Before starting her journey, the woman had checked in at the nearby ranger station. They contacted us when she didn't return at the expected time. Within hours, we were all gathered. They gave us the details, and we launched the search. We spent 2 days in the mountains without any trace of her until the weather worsened, forcing us to stop. The bad weather kept us away from the mountain for almost a week, and when we were finally able to return, the search had turned into a recovery operation. Sadly, after nearly a month, we didn't find a single clue, no footprints, no clothing, nothing. At that time, we didn't know that this would be the first of many related searches in the years to come. After that, we had 3 or 4 successful searches. However, on a cold, cloudy autumn afternoon, we received a call about a missing couple. They had registered to camp for a week, but after 4 days, they were reported missing. When we arrived at their campsite, we saw signs that someone had rummaged through their tent. Many of their belongings were destroyed, and it even seemed like something had been stolen. It looked like foul play. Fortunately, some members of the sheriff's department were training with us and ensured everything was handled properly. The winter passed, and everything remained quiet until spring came. Some climbers went missing but were quickly found safe and sound. However, when the thaw came, we were met with an unexpected surprise. A group of men who maintained the trails, as they did every year, found the body of a young woman. The most puzzling part was that we had no reports of missing women in the park or the surrounding areas. As far as I know, that woman remains unidentified to this day. We had barely had time to process that discovery when another young woman disappeared. She had been camping with a group of friends, but at some point, she got separated from them. They called us at the end of the day, and the next day we found her clothes neatly folded on a ledge, more than 15 meters down. The Columbia River ran swiftly below, and we assumed she had jumped to her death. With no evidence suggesting otherwise, her disappearance was classified as a suicide, and the case was closed, or so we thought. The next search we conducted raised suspicions that there might be a serial killer in the area. As was common practice, when a couple didn't check out with the rangers upon leaving, we were contacted to begin a search. We started at their campsite, but there was no sign of their gear. We continued searching along the trail, assuming they might have camped somewhere else. 2 days passed, and we found no trace of them. Finally, on the 3rd day, we found the man's body in a small cave. It showed clear signs of violence, very similar to the other homicide victims we had found in recent years. That was when the authorities began to connect the dots. From that point on, local officials did everything they could to keep the situation under wraps. They feared that it could severely impact tourism, on which the local economy heavily depended. Even when the press got wind of it, They denied everything and dismissed it as a conspiracy theory. They claimed that most, if not all, of the deaths were due to animal attacks. Few believed this, but it was the official story until the killers were captured nearly 2 decades later. After the disappearances stopped, everyone held their breath for an entire year, fearing the next case of a missing woman or couple. However, it seemed the streak had ended when I left the search and rescue team. I distanced myself from that chapter of my life. Sometimes, I'd chat with friends from that time, but the disappearances and murders never came up in conversation, until one day, out of the blue, I received an email from an old friend. It had been more than 15 years since the crimes, and what I saw when I opened the link left me speechless. 2 men had been arrested in connection with the murders. A piece of clothing had been retested for DNA, and 2 different samples were found. These were entered into a database, and both matched the 2 men, who were already serving time for assaults on women. Later in the article, it was mentioned that one of the men had made a deal and confessed to his involvement and the others in the murders. Although the article didn't provide many details, everything the man said aligned with the evidence. He led authorities to the bodies of victims that had yet to be found. Unfortunately, not all of the remains could be recovered. Too much time had passed, and it was assumed that animals or the weather had carried away or destroyed some of them. One detail stood out. The woman initially believed to have taken her own life was also included among the victims. However, the men never confessed to being involved in her death. After that, the story was practically forgotten. There were no trials, the men were given multiple life sentences, and everything was left in the past. Apart from the victims' families, my memories and those of my former search team colleagues are the only things that keep that story alive. Now retired, and with many of those friends having passed away, I feel it's right to pass these stories on to someone else. People say that on the internet, nothing is ever truly erased, and I hope that's true. I'll be able to rest easier knowing that the memory of those innocent victims will live on, far beyond what any of them could have imagined. They deserve that, don't you think? I don't remember a time in my life before the mountains became a part of me. From the moment I learned to walk, my parents would take me with them to hike through the forests and peaks of the Rockies. At least 1 week every year was spent camping, with long hikes to secluded spots, only briefly interrupted for fishing. Although I never fell in love with fishing like my dad, hiking and climbing mountains were things I fully embraced. When my father became too old to accompany me into the mountains, I started looking for others to go with. Over the years, I had all kinds of climbing partners. Some became great friends, while others were only in my life for a short time. I climbed every mountain, rocky hill, or snowy peak I could reach. More than once, I was seconds from death. Obviously, I survived, but after a bad day on Denali, where I lost all the toes on one foot and a finger on one hand, I decided to leave the big summits behind. That didn't completely take me away from the mountains, though. Until a month ago, I had still been hiking on a nearby rocky hill. My outings were no longer as thrilling as before, but an incident about 10 years ago shook my confidence a bit. At that time, I was about 32 years old and in excellent shape. That day, I had already done my usual 5-mile bike ride and was getting ready for a short hike in the mountains. I arrived just after noon, parked my truck, and started up my favorite trail. I remember it was a sunny, warm day with no sign of bad weather. I was making good progress and reached my usual resting point in about 2 hours. There were other hikers there, and we shared lunch before I headed back down toward my truck. About 20 minutes into my descent, I came across a new group of hikers. They looked very distressed and, upon seeing me, ran over to ask if I had seen a woman hiking alone on the trail. I told them no, that I hadn't encountered anyone. That's when they explained that they had lost one of the members of their group while heading to the summit. Without hesitation, I offered to help them search. They accepted my offer, and we spent the rest of the afternoon searching all the possible areas we could think of. Some places we checked more than once, and by then, the search and rescue team had joined us and taken control of the operation. About an hour before sunset, I was assigned to search a small area along the edge of a stream. My group was made up of me and a few members of the rescue team. It was thought that the woman couldn't have fallen into the water because of the trees lining the stream, but there was an open stretch where she could have ended up in the water and been swept downstream. I suggested my idea and asked for someone from the group to come with me as we followed the stream until dark. We got into the water and started moving along the current, carefully checking each side of the bank for any signs. About 15 meters ahead, my partner shouted. He had spotted something bright blue tangled in some branches on his side of the stream. I went over to help him pull out whatever he had seen. It didn't take long before we found ourselves face to face with the woman we had been searching for. She was floating on her back. My partner checked her pulse, probably not expecting to find anything, but to his surprise, he detected one, although it was very weak. He stayed with the victim while I ran to get help from the rest of the team. I feared she might die before they arrived, but luckily, that didn't happen. The paramedics arrived quickly, placed her on a stretcher, and rushed her away. It was a rewarding end to an exhausting day, though the poor woman still had a long road to recovery before she was completely out of danger. My part was done, so I went home. I was so tired I slept until the following afternoon. I knew it would be several days before there was any news, so I tried to go about my life while I waited. 5 days later, a member of the group called to tell me that the woman was stable and that she wanted to see me in person to thank me. I went to the hospital that same afternoon. Just as they said, she thanked me for helping in the search. I admit, I was a bit out of my comfort zone. I'm a fairly shy and humble person, so I thanked her and tried to change the subject. Over time, she told me what had happened that day on the mountain. She said she felt out of breath and had stopped to rest by the stream when, suddenly, she felt a sharp pain in her chest, so intense that she lost consciousness. That was the last thing she remembered until waking up in the hospital the next morning. It was shocking to hear that a 35-year-old woman had suffered a heart attack. But I suppose none of us is as healthy as we think we are. Her near-death experience changed my life, just as mine had years earlier. Since then, I make sure to visit the doctor regularly and get checkups every few years. No matter what we believe in our youth, none of us is truly invincible. I didn't survive freezing temperatures high on a mountain and lose toes, only to die of a heart attack in a supermarket. So please, take care of yourselves. Life is too precious to take for granted. I grew up in a neighborhood that was pretty isolated, on the outskirts of town. Not many people from outside even knew we existed. The development had been built on an old farm, and most of the undeveloped land was forest. Being kids with not much to do, we spent most of our days in those woods. There was a makeshift clubhouse there for as long as I could remember, but one summer we rebuilt it, improving it. That new clubhouse became our refuge, a place where we could escape from our complicated lives. Many of us came from difficult families, and the club offered us a break from the chaos. One of our friends, whose home had become unbearable because of his parents' divorce, even spent the entire summer living there. To be honest, I don't think his parents even realized he had disappeared. The rest of us would come and go at all hours, day and night, and the clubhouse became especially useful on days we decided to skip school. During the warmer months, we spent a lot of time swimming and fishing in a nearby creek, where I actually learned to swim. We had a rope tied to a tree for jumping into the water, although the creek was rarely deep enough to use it. When we weren't in the water, we would just hang out for hours. But over time, our curiosity grew, and unfortunately, so did our cruelty. I think that attitude led us to lose one of our own in a terrible way. In the first year, we kept our distance from the homeless people who occasionally wandered the area. They had no idea we were there, or so we thought. I'm not sure how they found out. One night, while we were on the hill as usual, one of them started shouting and insulting us. I remember feeling butterflies in my stomach. I was barely 10 or 11 years old, and any adult yelling at me scared me. Some of the kids shouted back, but nothing serious. From that moment on, knowing that we had been discovered, the fun of watching them disappeared. However, the conflict didn't end there. One day, when we arrived at the clubhouse, we found it destroyed. Someone had knocked down the roof and spray-painted "Get Out, Kids" on one of the walls. I remember feeling anger instead of fear. They had crossed a line, and we weren't about to let it slide. The next day, 4 of us skipped school to get revenge. We knew the homeless people usually left during the day, so we took the opportunity to destroy their shelters and burn anything flammable, including tents and sleeping bags. We left, thinking that would put an end to it, and for a while, it seemed to work. There were no reprisals, and we went on with our lives. But over time, our curiosity returned, and some of us went back to the woods. Little by little, the insults started up again. Eventually, someone began throwing rocks, and soon that became the norm. I'm not sure if we ever actually hurt any of them or if they hurt us, but the situation escalated until one day, the homeless people returned to the clubhouse and completely destroyed it. Not a trace of metal or wood was left. We thought maybe the landowner had done it, but then one of them bragged about being responsible. That enraged us, and we went back to their camp for more revenge. To our shock, we saw that part of their shelter was built using the metal from our clubhouse. This set us off. Instead of burning their things, we decided to humiliate them. While some of the boys hauled the metal away, the rest of us urinated on anything that could absorb it. One of them even defecated on a table. What had started as childish games had turned ugly. But soon, the adults decided enough was enough. The oldest of us was 14, and the rest of us were younger. Mike, one of my closest friends, was 12. He lived just a street away from me, and although his family life had been normal, everything changed after his father died in a motorcycle accident. His mother began working non-stop to keep the household running, which left him alone most of the time. Sometimes, he stayed at one of our houses, but when that wasn't possible, he would spend the night at the clubhouse. One night, Mike decided to stay at the clubhouse by himself. He asked if any of us wanted to join him, but we just weren't in the mood. The next day, several of us gathered to put the finishing touches on the new clubhouse. We didn't talk much about Mike, assuming he would be there when we arrived. When he wasn't, we didn't worry too much, thinking he was either at home or with his mom. Later that day, when I passed by his house, his mother told me he hadn't come home the night before. She looked worried, but I brushed it off and went home. The next morning, I woke up to chaos. Mike's mom was frantic, asking me if I knew where he was. I was so confused I didn't know what to tell her. Mike hadn't returned home, and even though she had called everyone she knew, no one had seen him. In the end, we went to school like any other day, although we all had our theories about what had happened to him, ranging from alien abductions to other far-fetched ideas. But only our group knew about the war with the homeless. One by one, we were pulled out of class for questioning. None of us said anything. We knew that if we revealed what had been going on, we'd lose everything. But in the end, it didn't matter. Someone told the police about the time we spent in the woods, and soon they discovered everything, the clubhouse, the camp, all of it. The police organized a search and rescue team, and many of our neighbors joined in. Seeing all those adults combing through the woods was heartbreaking. We knew our little hideaway, our sanctuary, would never be the same. The homeless kept their mouths shut, just like we did. Maybe we had more in common than we realized. After days of searching, they didn't find any trace of Mike. His body was never recovered, and no one was charged with his disappearance. I still like to imagine that Mike ran away, that he found a family who took him in, and that he's living happily somewhere. Maybe it's just a childish fantasy to cope with the loss, but I prefer that illusion over facing the possibility that he was killed either by the hands of the homeless or something worse. After everything that happened, we tried to rebuild the clubhouse, but it was never the same. We had grown up, our interests had changed, and most importantly, the heart of our group, Mike, was no longer with us. Sometimes, before I left for college, I'd walk through those woods, alone with my thoughts. I still felt a strange sense of emptiness, but also a familiar, melancholic presence. In those moments, it was as if Mike was still there with me, as if nothing had changed. And looking back, I think in some way, he never really left. About 20 years ago, when I was a young scout, I decided to follow in my father's footsteps. He had been a scout as well and achieved the rank of Eagle, which inspired me to aim for the same. Our scout leader, who was also a personal friend of my dad, always encouraged us to do as much volunteer work as possible. That's how I got involved with search and rescue efforts in the county. There wasn't a need for a permanent team, as disappearances were quite rare, and there weren't enough resources to maintain a specialized group. My first experience with search and rescue was when the daughter of an elderly man reported him missing. It took the county deputies almost an entire day to find his abandoned car on an old logging road. The forest surrounding the area was too vast for them to cover alone, so they contacted our scout leader for help, and we answered the call. I loved the experience. It felt like a treasure hunt, but one that I took very seriously. I was thrilled to learn that the elderly man was found the next day, safe and sound. He had set up a camp when he realized he was lost, and although he was a bit disoriented, his hunting instincts had kept him safe. The reason I'm sharing this now is to tell the story of the largest search I ever participated in with my fellow scouts. It was the summer of 2002, and I was dreading the upcoming return to school. I was about to start my senior year of high school, and with it came the responsibilities I feared most, chief among them, choosing a college. The truth is, I had lost all interest in school and nearly everything related to it. Everything felt pointless. Even scouting, something I had loved since I was little, now seemed childish and silly. I had been wanting to quit the Scouts for almost a year but couldn't bring myself to tell my dad, who had high hopes for me. In the midst of all that internal confusion, I got a call from our scout leader, asking me to come to his house. I went reluctantly, and there I learned that we had been asked to assist in a new search operation. Despite everything going on in my life, it was a very welcome distraction. The excitement for the search was still very much alive in me. Being part of something so important gave me a sense of purpose that nothing else could offer at the time. We all piled into the truck and headed to the national park. The first day, we didn't accomplish much since the sun set shortly after we arrived. We set up camp near where the missing man had been the night before, and the next morning, at dawn, we prepared to continue the search. That day was more fruitful. Several people reported having seen the man, and one woman even spoke with him briefly. According to her, he didn't show any signs of distress and was, in her words, in good spirits. Despite all the information we gathered, the man was still nowhere to be found. By the third day, the urgency in the group was palpable. We knew that without water, a person could only survive about 3 days at best. I began to wonder if maybe he had gone into the woods to end his life, but the woman's account gave me a glimmer of hope. Around midday, we reached a complex of caves. They weren't much more than a series of small tunnels, barely large enough to crawl through. We split into pairs to search each cave. My friend and I were nearing the end of the second cave when we noticed a collapse. At first, all we could see were rocks and dirt, but my friend spotted something that didn't quite fit. As we got closer, we began moving the rocks, and suddenly, a leg moved. It wasn't long before the other scouts joined us in the cave, and some ran off to get help while we kept digging. I couldn't believe the man had survived with so many rocks on top of him, let alone nearly 3 days in those conditions. Within 10 minutes, we cleared enough space to see his face. He weakly opened his eyes, and one of the adults offered him water. He grabbed it and drank with a desperation that terrified me. I had never seen such desperation in a person, and I hope never to see it again. The paramedics arrived and took him away immediately. I didn't see him again until several months later. By then, I was halfway through my senior year of high school. I had finally mustered the courage to tell my dad I wanted to leave the Scouts, and he took it much better than I expected. There were no yelling or harsh words. Though he was clearly disappointed, he didn't try to guilt-trip me. One day, I received a message from my former Scout leader saying he had a surprise for me but wouldn't tell me what it was. I went to his house, and there I saw a familiar face. It was the man we had found in the cave. It turned out he was a German immigrant who had only recently arrived in the country. That weekend, he had gone out to explore the park near his new home. He wanted to thank me for saving his life. I didn't really know how to react. All I could do was thank him and shake his hand. We talked for about an hour, and before he left, he gave me a strong hug. It's a day I'll never forget, and I'm glad we were able to speak under better circumstances. Since then, we've stayed in touch by email, and every year at Christmas, I get a card with a photo of his family. After that day, he got married and had 5 children. Even if I accomplish nothing else in life, I can always say with pride that I saved a life. In 2018, my life began to completely fall apart. Early that year, my mother was diagnosed with terminal cancer. My dad had already passed away 5 years earlier from a heart attack, and the thought of losing her too felt unbearable. I made it my mission to keep her alive as long as possible. The treatment was working well, and she had outlived the initial prognosis. Both of us were optimistic about her future. But then the pandemic hit, and she was one of the first people in our town to catch it. She fought with all her strength, but in the end, her immune system couldn't take it anymore, and she lost the battle. Due to the restrictions at the time, I couldn't even organize a funeral for her. Of all the hard things we went through during that period, that was the hardest for me. Shortly after, my Aunt Penny, the only family I had left, also passed away suddenly. I found myself completely alone, with no one to talk to or lean on. I fell into a deep sadness, dragging myself through each day, just waiting for my own end. 2 more years passed, and while life for most people returned to normal, I remained stuck, drowning in grief. I needed some kind of closure. So, I decided to organize a small funeral at my mother's grave. Maybe, if I could finally say goodbye, I could start to heal. Around 30 people attended the service. A friend of my mom's gave a beautiful speech, and several others shared happy memories of her. I felt a sense of relief. It was exactly what I needed. During one of the conversations afterward, that same friend suggested I take some time for myself, something like a small vacation. It seemed like a good idea. I spent nearly a week researching destinations and eventually decided on a spot about an hour north of my house. I won't say exactly where, but it was a national park in the Pacific Northwest of the US. The drive was peaceful, and the park was beautiful. I found a campsite away from the other visitors and set up my small tent. I had only used it once before, so it took me a while to get everything set up. I was too tired to start a campfire, so I fell asleep immediately. I woke up just before dawn, ready to explore. I packed a light bag and grabbed my new camera. The morning flew by faster than expected, and my planned lunch ended up being just a cup of tea and a sandwich. I reached my destination in about an hour and stayed there for another hour, taking photos before heading back. Halfway along the return trail, I came across a wide clearing full of wildflowers. I picked a few for my journal. Everything seemed peaceful, but then I encountered my worst nightmare, a grizzly bear. Everything happened so quickly that I didn't have time to think of an escape plan. The bear must have been hiding in the shadows because I didn't see it until it was almost right in front of me. I think I startled it just as much as it startled me. In the blink of an eye, the beast stood up on its hind legs and let out a roar so powerful it froze me in place. My instincts took over, and although I knew I shouldn't run, I did. I bolted toward the nearest cover, hearing the sounds of the bear chasing me, branches snapping, leaves crunching beneath its massive paws. I could hear the bear's heavy breathing as I ran. I sprinted about 50 meters before reaching a wide stream. In any other situation, I would have looked for a safe way to cross, but this was life or death. Without thinking, I jumped with all my strength and barely made it to the other side, clawing at the dirt to pull myself up. As soon as my feet hit the ground, I kept running. At some point, I realized the noises had stopped. I looked back and saw the bear wasn't following me anymore. I suppose it didn't like its chances of crossing the stream and just stopped there. A wave of relief washed over me, but it didn't last long. I quickly realized I had another problem. I had no idea where I was. I tried to find my way back, but after an hour, I gave up. Thankfully, I had some emergency supplies with me, and since nightfall was approaching fast, I found a flat, open area and built a fire. I ate my last energy bar and curled up next to the fire, hoping to sleep. I woke up a few hours later when the fire had burned down. I threw a large log I had set aside onto the embers, and soon, the flames were crackling again, keeping me warm until morning. Around 8 a.m., I woke up, extinguished the fire, and continued walking in the same direction, hoping to find some sign of civilization. After several hours of walking, I heard someone shouting in the distance. I followed the sound for about 10 minutes and, to my surprise, it wasn't another bear, but a member of the search team who had been looking for me. I thanked him and hugged him tightly. It turns out I had been walking in circles the entire day. They told me that was common, but it didn't make me feel any less foolish. However, I had done one smart thing before heading out. I had told someone about my plans and ensured they would check on me if I didn't return. That likely saved my life. I learned a lot from those frantic days. I had been so focused on all the lives I had lost around me that I had forgotten about the most important one, my own. In retrospect, I guess the trip was exactly what I needed. I can't say that nearly being attacked by a bear was the best way to gain clarity, but we don't always get to choose how we learn life's lessons. I hope everyone reading this is doing well. Now, go out and experience this incredible world we live in. Life moves fast, and for many, it ends too soon. Enjoy it while you can. At a party in 2010, a mutual friend introduced us. From the moment I saw her, I was drawn to her, but I couldn't believe someone so beautiful could have anything in common with me. That changed when she mentioned she liked mountain biking. In that instant, she had my full attention. I had been competing in mountain bike races since my teens, something I took very seriously, so much so that my friends and I had built our own cross-country circuit by hand one summer. I had never met a girl as attractive as her who shared any of my interests, let alone my favorite hobby. Over time, I realized that's why our friend had introduced us. We sat in a quiet corner of the house and talked until the sun came up. Then we went to breakfast, just the two of us, and got to know each other better. It felt surreal, and I was afraid that when it ended, I would wake up alone in my small apartment. Saying goodbye to her that morning was one of the hardest things I had ever done. We had made plans to go mountain biking together the following weekend, but I had serious doubts it would actually happen. The next Saturday, I was at Target buying some things when I received a message from Holly. In my insecurity, I thought my friends were playing a prank on me. I had told them how incredible I thought she was, and guys can be cruel sometimes. But she assured me it was really her. Still, as I drove to the mountains, I remained skeptical. When I arrived at the parking lot and saw her, it all became real. My stomach dropped. This would be the ultimate test for both of us. I would find out if she lived up to the idealized image I had in my head, and she would discover if I was worth her time. From the moment we started pedaling down the trail, it was a constant competition. Neither of us wanted to give an inch. Although I managed to stay ahead, she gave me a serious run for my money. By the end of the day, we had both passed the test, at least in my eyes. To keep it brief, I'll summarize the following years in one sentence. Our relationship blossomed into a deep love, and we began planning our wedding after graduation. We had met during our sophomore year of college, so there was no rush to take that final step. For us, if we were destined to be together forever, waiting until we finished school wouldn't change anything. On my end, I wasn't entirely sure we'd make it to the altar, but that had more to do with my own insecurities than anything else. When the wedding day finally arrived, I still had a small knot of fear deep in my mind. I don't think I breathed until we were in the car, on the way to the airport. From there, we left for our honeymoon in Colorado. Naturally, much of the trip would be spent exploring mountain trails on our bikes. It would be an unforgettable trip in every sense. The first few days were spent taking in the scenery and visiting friends in the area. It wasn't until the fourth day that we finally ventured out onto the trails. We had no plans to do anything crazy, no races or competitions. We were saving that for future trips. We just wanted to enjoy the scenery and nature. Our campsite was about 3 kilometers from the park, and that morning, we informed the park office of our plans before setting out. The day was set to be warm, and the morning was perfect for riding. As usual, our competitive spirit kicked in. Holly glanced at me, smiled, and shot down the trail. I chased after her with everything I had. She was about 20 meters ahead of me when, As she rounded a curve, I saw her lose traction on the loose gravel and tumble down the hill. I rushed to where she had landed, and when I got there, she was conscious but clearly in a lot of pain. To my horror, I saw a small piece of bone protruding through the skin of her leg. I don't think she realized it, as she tried to stand. I stopped her before she could make things worse, and she quickly lay back down, now complaining of back pain. This made me suspect she might have a spinal injury as well. I knew I couldn't move her, so I covered her with my jacket and told her to stay still. I pulled out my phone to call 911, but I couldn't connect. I only had half a bar of signal. Panic started to set in, but I tried to stay calm. I was faced with a difficult decision: stay with Holly and hope someone passed by, or get on my bike and find a stronger signal. As I was weighing my options, Holly's adrenaline began to wear off, and the pain intensified. I couldn't just sit there and watch her suffer. The decision became clear. I sat beside her, explained the situation, and although she was scared, we both knew it was what had to be done. She kissed me and told me to go. I jumped on my bike and pedaled as fast as I could. About a kilometer away, I reached a clearing in the trees, and this time, the phone showed 2 full bars. I called 911, and the call connected. I gave the operator all the information I could. An overwhelming feeling told me to get back to Holly as soon as possible, so I thanked the operator, hung up, and raced back. Holly was relieved when she heard help was on the way. While we waited for the rescue team to arrive, I tried to distract her from the pain. I started with a few jokes, but laughing only made her hurt more, so we changed the subject and began talking about what we would do after all this was over. It wasn't long before we heard the sound of a helicopter approaching. Within minutes, a rescue team had reached us, and everything went like clockwork. In no time, Holly was on a stretcher and being flown to the hospital. We spent 2 nights there, and the staff was incredibly professional. The doctors congratulated me for not moving her, which had prevented her injuries from getting worse. It turns out she also had a mild concussion, something neither of us had realized. I can't take credit for doing everything right, it was pure luck. Holly's leg healed in a few months, and her back injury, which involved a few fractured vertebrae, required 2 surgeries to fully recover. After extensive rehab, she was back on her bike in no time. Shortly after, the doctors gave her a clean bill of health, although I know the pain comes back from time to time. The accident disrupted our plans at the time, but we returned to Colorado 2 years later to finish our honeymoon. In a move very out of character for us, we didn't ride our bikes a single time during that trip. It felt strange at first, but we quickly got used to it. I'll admit, it's much easier to enjoy the scenery when you're not flying through it at full speed. As for racing, neither of us competes as much as we used to. Having kids has put those activities on hold for now, but we've agreed that it's something we'll introduce them to as soon as they're old enough. It can be dangerous at times, both to life and limb, but that's what makes life worth living, don't you think? When I was 18, I met the man who would change my life forever, and this story is about him. Caleb West was born in 1955 in a remote part of Montana. From a very young age, he spent his time in the nearby woods and mountains. He was a naturalist, a skilled marksman, and a hunter, skills that were crucial in helping his family survive the harsh Montana winters. At 14, Caleb started rock climbing, and by pure chance, he encountered a group of older boys during a camping trip. The group, who were from out of town, was climbing a local peak and became fascinated with Caleb's natural agility and strength. They invited him to join them, and like everything Caleb did, he adapted to climbing like a fish to water. In no time, he surpassed all his mentors and became one of the best young climbers in the state. Instead of moving away to attend college, Caleb chose to stay close to home, working as a ranch hand and hunting guide. Though his job kept him busy, he always found time to climb. Many of the older climbers he had grown up with now had families and barely had time for activities like that. Perhaps because he lacked climbing partners, Caleb felt drawn to the world of search and rescue. Occasionally, he would run into search and rescue teams in the mountains while they were looking for lost hunters or hikers, but he never considered doing it professionally. It was an invitation from an old climbing friend that sparked his interest. The rescue team often struggled with a shortage of experienced climbers, which put them at a disadvantage in many situations. Caleb was the perfect man for the job. His skills in moving through the forest, tracking, and naturally reaching difficult places made him stand out in the group. It didn't take long for him to make a name for himself in the rescue community. Over the next 20 years, Caleb rose through the ranks of the team, rescuing hundreds of lost or trapped people. It was in 1997 when our paths first crossed. Caleb was teaching beginner climbing classes at the gym I attended. We started talking, and before I knew it, I had become his new climbing partner. Those years taught me a lot about climbing and teamwork, and they were not without their share of thrills. We had been climbing together for over 3 years when I made a nearly fatal mistake that almost led to a 300-meter fall for both Caleb and me. Like the experienced professional he was, Caleb acted quickly, stopping our fall before it was too late. After that, my respect and loyalty to him became unshakable. Eventually, I went off to college, but my heart was always in the mountains. As soon as I failed in my studies, I went straight back to Caleb, asking him for a job. At first, he was hesitant, believing I'd do better in school, but after talking with my parents and getting their blessing, he agreed. From that point on, I worked alongside Caleb for the next 7 years, learning everything I could: tracking, first aid, and even rescue planning. Caleb was an excellent teacher, but even now, nearing 50, I know I still have much to learn. By 2008, Caleb had started to step back a bit, letting the younger members of the team gain more experience. We were searching for a lost climber when the worst happened. Caleb was in the helicopter, leading the search, when a gust of wind pushed it too close to the mountain. The helicopter plummeted into the valley and crashed. Tragically, no one survived. It was the greatest tragedy of my life. Caleb had become more than just a friend. He was like a second father to me, and losing him was a nightmare. However, we didn't have time to mourn. There was still a man lost on the mountain, and not finding him would have meant that Caleb lost his life in vain. We found the climber the next day, and only then could we allow ourselves to grieve. I stayed with the team until 2015, when I decided to seek safer employment. Perhaps by chance, or maybe by fate, I discovered that my wife was expecting our second child the same week as the accident. It was a bittersweet moment. Suddenly, my wife suggested we name our son after Caleb. At first, I hesitated, thinking it would be a terrible reminder of that dark day. But today, so many years later, I'm glad I agreed. Every time I look at my wonderful son, I not only see the product of our love, but I also remember the man who helped shape me into who I am, a great friend and mentor, but most importantly, a hero to so many he rescued in their darkest moments. May his name live on forever,